I stood frozen at the doorway, my breath caught in my throat. What I saw wasn't just unexpected. It was the last thing I ever thought I'd witness. My stepson, Kyle, wasn't the confident young man I thought I knew. Vulnerability hung in the air, thick and palpable. In that moment, everything I believed about our peaceful family life was shattered, and a strange, unspoken tension filled the room. Kyle was my stepson, a confident and charming 22-year-old with a seemingly unshakable demeanor. His energy often lit up the house, especially when his father and I were caught up in the mundane. However, there were moments when his bravado would falter, revealing a quieter, introspective side, a side he rarely let anyone see. I had always admired his resilience, believing that he had inherited his father's strength. Our relationship had always been comfortable. I married his father 5 years ago, and despite the initial awkwardness, Kyle had welcomed me warmly into his life. He had a way of making everyone feel at ease, his humor and kindness a constant in our home. Over the years, I became more than just his stepmother. I became someone he trusted, someone who supported him when life threw its inevitable curveballs. That weekend was supposed to be routine. My husband had gone on a fishing trip with his friends, leaving Kyle and me alone in the house. The silence, which was usually a rare and treasured luxury, felt strangely heavy. I busied myself with cleaning, folding laundry, and sipping iced tea on the porch, trying to dispel the unease that seemed to settle over me. Kyle had spent most of the day in his room, the faint hum of music leaking through the floorboards above. I told myself not to intrude. He was an adult, after all, but a nagging sense of worry kept tugging at the back of my mind. It wasn't like him to retreat so completely. When I finally ventured upstairs, I convinced myself it was just to check on him. I paused outside his door, debating whether to knock. The music had stopped, and the quiet was almost oppressive. My curiosity, and perhaps my concern, got the better of me. I opened the door a crack and peered inside. What I saw was not what I expected. Kyle sat on the edge of his bed, his head bowed and shoulders tense. He looked vulnerable, almost lost, and my heart ached in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just worry, it was a deep, emotional pull I hadn't felt before. In that instant, I knew something had changed, but I didn't yet understand how profoundly it would alter our lives. After that fleeting moment at Kyle's door, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. There was something so raw about the way he sat there, lost in his thoughts. It was a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him before, and it unsettled me in ways I couldn't articulate. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was normal for young adults to have their struggles, but the memory lingered. The next day, I found myself watching him more closely, noticing little things I'd never paid attention to before. He seemed distracted, his usually confident demeanor replaced with a quiet hesitance. He avoided eye contact, his movements more careful than usual, almost as if he were trying not to draw attention to himself. It was subtle, but to someone who knew him as well as I did, it was glaring. At dinner, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. Kyle pushed his food around on his plate, stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his friends, his plans for the week, but his responses were short and evasive. "Everything okay?" I asked finally, my voice soft. He nodded quickly, too quickly, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." But I didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't saying, and the weight of it hung between us like an invisible wall. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he in trouble? Was it school, work, a relationship? I wanted to press him for answers, but I didn't want to push him further away. So I let it go, hoping he would come to me when he was ready. That night, I heard him pacing in his room. The soft creak of the floorboards echoed through the otherwise silent house, each step a reminder that something was deeply wrong. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between wanting to give him space and wanting to be the person he could confide in. The next morning, I decided to confront him. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. The sunlight streaming through the window cast a warm glow on his face, highlighting the faint lines of worry etched into his expression. "Kyle," I said gently, stepping into the room. He turned to face me, his eyes wide with surprise. "I feel like something's been bothering you lately. You know you can talk to me, right?" He hesitated, his grip tightening around the mug. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" I pressed, keeping my tone light and encouraging. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted after a long pause. I guess I just feel out of place sometimes. Out of place, I repeated, stepping closer. In what way? He shrugged, a faint, self-deprecating smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Like I don't know where I fit in. With Dad, with you, with myself. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a pang of guilt for not noticing sooner. Kyle, I said softly, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his arm. You don't have to figure everything out right now. It's okay to feel this way. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Something I couldn't quite place. Thanks, he said quietly. That means a lot. But even as he smiled, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling me. And the unspoken tension between us only seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The atmosphere in the house seemed to shift after our conversation in the kitchen. Kyle was more present, making an effort to engage in small talk and even offering to help with chores. But there was an underlying tension to his actions, as though he were trying to distract himself, or perhaps distract me, from whatever thoughts weighed on his mind. I noticed it in the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long, in the way he seemed to find reasons to be near me. A question about a recipe, a sudden interest in helping me organize the garage, things he never cared much about before. It was subtle, but undeniable. And as much as I told myself not to read into it, I couldn't ignore the warmth that spread through me whenever he was around. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Kyle walked in and plopped down on the couch with a sigh. He watched me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You always seem so put together, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, caught off guard by the comment. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shrugging. You just handle everything. Work, the house, Dad. It's like nothing ever phases you. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Trust me, Kyle, I'm far from perfect. I have my fair share of struggles. Probably more than you realize. He tilted his head, studying me as if trying to see through my words. You hide it well, he said quietly. His gaze held mine for a moment longer than was comfortable, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. I quickly looked away, focusing on the pile of clothes in front of me. It's not about hiding, I said finally. It's about learning to deal with things, one step at a time. Kyle didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me, the silence between us heavy with unspoken thoughts. I kept folding, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled slightly. When I glanced at him again, his expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart race. The next day it rained. The sound of the drops tapping against the windows created a soothing backdrop as I worked on dinner. Kyle came into the kitchen, his hair damp from stepping outside. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I moved around the space. Need any help? He asked, his tone casual. I smiled. If you're offering, you can stir the sauce. He stepped closer, his shoulder brushing mine as he reached for the spoon. The contact was fleeting but sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but his proximity made it difficult. Every movement felt amplified, every breath louder in the quiet kitchen. Smells good, he said, glancing at me. Thanks, I replied, keeping my eyes on the stove. It's just a simple recipe. Still, he said softly. You always make things feel special. His words hung in the air, and I felt my cheeks warm. I turned to face him, intending to make a light-hearted remark, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was a vulnerability there, a longing that mirrored something deep within me. Kyle, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, he said quickly, stepping back. I didn't mean to make things weird. You didn't, I assured him, though my heart was pounding. It's just a lot to take in. He nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and regret. I don't know how to explain it, he said after a moment. But being around you, it's like everything makes sense. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. The intensity in his voice, the raw honesty, it was overwhelming. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but the words wouldn't come. For the rest of the evening, we avoided talking about it, focusing instead on mundane tasks. But the unspoken tension lingered, an invisible thread pulling us closer even as we tried to maintain distance. Later that night, as I sat in bed reading, there was a soft knock at my door. I hesitated before calling out. Come in. Kyle stepped inside, looking uncertain. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I set my book aside, patting the edge of the bed. Do you want to talk? He nodded, sitting down next to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us. Then, he said softly, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that I feel safe with you. His words were like a punch to the gut, raw and honest. I placed a hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. You don't have to have all the answers right now, I said quietly. Just take it one day at a time. Kyle looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Thank you, he whispered. And as he leaned in slightly, his breath brushing against my cheek, I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same. The tension between Kyle and me had become almost unbearable. Every glance, every fleeting touch, felt charged with something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. It was as though we were both tiptoeing around an invisible line, too afraid to cross it, yet unable to step away. That night, the house was silent. My husband was still away, and the stillness only seemed to amplify the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the words on the page blurred together, my thoughts drifting back to Kyle again and again. His vulnerability, the way he looked at me, it was all consuming. A soft knock on my door startled me out of my thoughts. My heart raced as I called out, "Come in." Kyle stepped into the room, his expression hesitant. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled, as if he'd been lying in bed. There was something about his demeanor, nervous, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. "Hey," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Hey," I replied, setting my book aside. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted after a moment. I needed to talk to someone." I patted the spot next to me on the bed, and he sat down, keeping a careful distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching on and on. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began finally, his voice trembling slightly. "About not needing to meet anyone's expectations. I don't think I've ever really heard that before." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a pang of guilt for not realizing sooner just how much pressure he was under. "Kyle," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, not to your dad, not to me, not to anyone." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that made my heart race. "You make it sound so easy," he said quietly. "But it's not. Every day, it feels like I'm fighting to be enough, and I never quite get there." "You are enough," I said firmly, squeezing his arm. "You're more than enough, Kyle. And you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you." His gaze lingered on mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. I knew I should look away, say something to break the tension, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the intensity of his expression. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in. I felt his breath on my skin, warm and unsteady, as he closed the distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and insistent. Time seemed to slow, the moments stretching on and on as he moved closer. And then his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as though he were testing the waters. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further, but my body refused to move. I was caught in the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his actions. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, I could feel the weight of his emotions in the air between us. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. I couldn't keep it in anymore." "Kyle," I began, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, fear, guilt, and something I didn't want to name. "I know this is wrong," he said quickly, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't pretend anymore. You're the only person who makes me feel like I can be myself." His honesty was both heartbreaking and comforting, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This is complicated," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just act on these feelings without thinking about the consequences." "I know," he said, his tone earnest. "I know it's not simple, but I also know that I can't lose you. Whatever this is, it's the only thing that feels real." The raw vulnerability in his words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt my resolve weakening. "Kyle, we need to be careful," I said softly. "We need to think this through." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't want to do anything that would hurt you," he said quietly. "But I can't ignore how I feel." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Let's take it one step at a time," I said finally. "We need to figure out what this means, for both of us." He nodded again, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Okay," he said. "One step at a time." We sat there in silence for a long moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Kyle stood, his movements hesitant. "I should go," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. I nodded, my heart aching as I watched him leave. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone with my thoughts. As I sat there in the quiet of my room, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt, fear, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. I knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. But as I thought about the way Kyle had looked at me, the sincerity in his voice, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't something I had planned, and it certainly wasn't something I fully understood. But one thing was certain: nothing between us would ever be the same again. The house felt different the next morning. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and every interaction between Kyle and me was laced with tension. I kept replaying the events of the previous night in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant. Guilt weighed heavily on my shoulders, but it was tangled with a strange, inexplicable warmth I couldn't shake. Kyle avoided me at breakfast, mumbling a quick good morning before retreating to his room. I told myself to let him have his space, but every time I heard his footsteps upstairs, my heart raced. I couldn't deny that something had shifted between us, and it terrified me. Later that afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Kyle finally emerged. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether to come in or leave. When our eyes met, I saw a mixture of emotions in his gaze: uncertainty, guilt, and something deeper. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded, setting the laundry aside. He sat on the edge of the couch, his posture stiff, as though bracing himself for an argument. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "About last night. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to make things weird." "Kyle," I interrupted gently, "you don't have to apologize. But we do need to talk about this." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I know. I don't know how to explain what I'm feeling. It's like I've been holding it in for so long, and it just came out all at once." His honesty made my chest ache. "I understand," I said softly. "But this is complicated, Kyle. We have to think about how this affects everything. Our family, your dad, you." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose what we have, even if it's just this connection. You're the only person I feel like I can be myself with." His words hung in the air, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Kyle, I care about you," I said, my voice trembling. "More than I probably should. But we have to be careful. We can't let this ruin everything." He nodded, but his expression was conflicted. "I just don't know how to stop feeling this way," he admitted. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. "It's okay to feel confused," I said. "But we need to set boundaries, for both our sakes." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I'll try," he said softly. "I don't want to make things harder for you." We spent the rest of the day in a strange, tentative truce. Kyle stayed out of my way, and I tried to focus on mundane tasks to keep my mind from wandering. But every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, the tension between us flared up again. That evening, I heard the sound of my husband's car pulling into the driveway. A wave of relief washed over me. His presence would create a buffer, a distraction from the emotions swirling between Kyle and me. But it also brought a new wave of guilt. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what had happened? Knowing how I felt? At dinner, Kyle was unusually quiet. He barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on his plate. My husband didn't seem to notice, too busy talking about his fishing trip. I tried to engage in conversation, forcing a smile and pretending everything was normal. But inside, I felt like I was falling apart. After dinner, I retreated to my room, claiming I had a headache. I needed space, time to think. But the moment I closed the door behind me, the tears came. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, as the weight of everything hit me all at once. What had I done? How had I let things get this far? I cared about Kyle deeply, but the feelings that had surfaced between us were dangerous, threatening to destroy the fragile balance of our family. I didn't know how to fix it, how to move forward without causing more damage. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I wiped my tears quickly, calling out, "Come in." Kyle stepped inside, his expression hesitant. "I just wanted to say good night," he said softly. "Good night," I replied, my voice hoarse. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he said, "I meant what I said earlier. I'll try to figure this out, to set boundaries. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, my voice breaking. "But we have to be careful, Kyle. We have to think about what's best for everyone." He nodded, his expression conflicted. "I know. I just hope we can get through this. As he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I knew we were treading dangerous ground, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But I also knew that we couldn't ignore what had happened, or the emotions that had come to light. The weight of the day pressed down on me as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Things would never be the same. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, the kind that clung to the air like a storm that refused to break. Kyle and I avoided being alone together as much as possible. My husband's presence served as a buffer, but it also felt like a constant reminder of the lines we'd crossed, even if only in our emotions. I found myself reflecting on the choices that had brought us here. How had I let things spiral so far out of control? It wasn't just about the kiss or the vulnerability we'd shared. It was about the deeper truths it had uncovered. Truths about loneliness, unmet emotional needs, and the complexity of human connection. One evening, as I was folding laundry in my room, Kyle knocked softly on the door. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I was ready to face him. But when I saw his expression, earnest and conflicted, I knew it was time to address what had been lingering between us. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded, motioning for him to come in. He sat on the edge of the bed, his posture tense but determined. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "About what happened, about us." I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. "I don't regret being honest with you," he said finally, his voice trembling slightly. "But I know this can't happen. It's not fair to you, to Dad, to anyone." His words hit me like a wave, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over me. "You're right," I said softly. "It's not fair to any of us. But I don't want you to think that what you're feeling is wrong or something to be ashamed of. Emotions are complicated, Kyle. They don't always make sense." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "It's just hard. You're the only person who's ever made me feel seen, like I'm not just pretending to be someone I'm not. And I'm glad you feel that way," I said, my voice steady but gentle. "But Kyle, it's important to channel those feelings into something healthy. You're still figuring out who you are, and that's okay. But this," I gestured between us, "isn't the answer." He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I know. I don't want to lose the connection we have." "You won't," I assured him. "But we need to redefine it. We need to focus on what's healthy, on being a family. That's what matters most." For the first time in days, Kyle smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that felt genuine. "Thank you," he said softly. "For understanding, for not hating me." I reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "I could never hate you, Kyle. You're family, and I'll always be here for you." As he left the room, I felt a sense of closure. Not complete, but enough to take the first step forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never is. But I knew that we had both learned something important from this experience, about boundaries, about emotions, and about the importance of addressing our needs in healthy ways. In the days that followed, Kyle began to open up more, not just to me, but to his father and his friends. He started pursuing hobbies he'd abandoned, finding new outlets for his energy and emotions. I watched him grow, little by little, and felt a quiet pride in his progress. As for me, I reflected on my own role in the situation. I had allowed myself to blur the lines, to seek emotional comfort in ways that weren't appropriate. It was a harsh but necessary lesson, a reminder that vulnerability and connection are powerful, but they must be handled with care. In the end, I knew that what mattered most was protecting the family we'd built. Mistakes had been made, but they didn't define us. What defined us was how we chose to move forward, to heal, to grow, and to rebuild the trust and love that held us together. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the most painful experiences. But those lessons can also be the most transformative, teaching us to navigate the complexities of life and relationships with greater wisdom and compassion. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? Could you move past it, or would it forever change your relationships? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping stories that explore the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.